The costs of China's chaotic exit from its zero-COVID strategy are surging. It was the first time that the Communist Party in China saw large protests throughout the nation, and who knows, the situation might get even worse in the future. But before we move on, make sure you press the like button. And if you do like watching videos about politics and global paradigm shifts, make sure you press that subscribe button. For those of you unaware, let us just provide you guys with a brief recap. In the past few months in China, hospitals, pharmacies, and funeral homes have been overwhelmed, but the scale of the misery is anyone's guess. The country no longer tallies asymptomatic infections or reliably reports COVID deaths, employing not the distortion of statistics, but their omission. China's goal in fighting COVID-19 is to keep cases as close to zero as possible. To achieve this, it has implemented mass testing, quarantined the sick in government facilities, and imposed strict lockdowns that can span entire cities. Initially, public discontent over the government's approach was minimal, with many expressing pride in the country's ability to keep cases to almost none. However, as the virus has become more transmittable, cases have increased across China, and lockdowns have become more severe. Public anger has mounted, leading to protests in multiple cities. Lockdowns or restrictions on travel in China have damaged local supply chains. This has considerable impact on both production facilities and on domestic consumption and exports, and has exacted a heavy price on internal tourism. China's foreign tourism is almost non-existent, and the dominant internal tourism market is also in trouble. Despite some instances of growth, some people are reluctant to leave the area where they live and find themselves caught in a lockdown in another area. Repeated lockdowns, particularly in areas of eastern and southeastern China, the heartland of Chinese manufacturing and commerce, mean instability for factories and companies. While this policy may have restricted the COVID cases, it has also wreaked havoc for the masses. After months of forceful tests, quarantines, and devastating economic conditions, the balloon finally popped and the nationwide protests began. China says its strategy has kept coronavirus cases and deaths low compared with Western countries. China has nearly 16,000 COVID-19 deaths among its population of 1.4 billion, according to the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center, while the United States, the country hardest hit by the pandemic, has recorded more than 1 million deaths. Amid growing protests across the nation, the Chinese Communist Party finally mitigated the draconian zero-COVID policy, and it seemed like this is a major symbol of the weakening hold of the Communist Party. But it was then that they bounced back in their symbolic fashion. The abrupt end to some of the world's strictest COVID controls, following rare protests against Xi and the Communist Party in late November, led to a wave of sickness and death across the world's second biggest economy, overwhelming hospitals and crematoriums. Although Chinese officials declared a decisive victory over the virus in February for the second time, the long-term political consequences for Xi remain unclear. But now that President Xi is in his record third term, will he ever regain the trust of his people? And if so, what steps can we expect, and what would the consequences be? But one of the most powerful weapons for the Xi government to regain its lost trust is the anti-West stance, which seems to be working. The Chinese government has been known to have an anti-Western stance on certain issues, particularly in areas such as politics, economics, and culture. This stance has its roots in China's history of colonization, imperialism, and unequal treaties with Western powers during the 19th and 20th centuries. One of the main grievances that China has had with the West is the perceived interference in its internal affairs. The Chinese government often accuses Western countries of using human rights and democracy as a pretext to meddle in its domestic affairs, particularly on issues such as Tibet, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang. Moreover, China often criticizes the West for its historical and contemporary failures, citing issues such as the racial discrimination, income inequality, and the failure to provide universal health care as examples of systemic failures in the Western system. China has also criticized Western economic policies and practices, particularly regarding trade and investment. Chinese officials often accuse Western countries of pursuing protectionist policies that seek to contain China's rise as an economic power. They argue that the West is trying to maintain its economic dominance by restricting China's access to advanced technologies and markets. The anti-Western stance can be seen in the government's emphasis on core socialist values, which prioritize loyalty to the state, collectivism, and social harmony over individualism and Western-style democracy. One way in which the government has sought to promote this narrative is through the education system. In recent years, the government has implemented reforms to the national curriculum that emphasize patriotism and national identity and downplay the role of Western ideas and values. This has included the removal of some Western literature and the promotion of Chinese classics as the foundation of the country's cultural heritage. The Chinese media has also been criticized for promoting anti-Western narratives. State-owned media outlets have been accused of portraying Western countries as decadent and immoral, while portraying China as a rising power that is challenging the Western-dominated world order. This type of narrative has been particularly evident in the government's response to issues such as the Hong Kong protests and the coronavirus pandemic. In addition, the Chinese government has been accused of using censorship and propaganda to control the narrative around certain issues. For example, the government has been criticized for its handling of the Xinjiang region, where it has been accused of committing human rights abuses against the Uyghur Muslims. The government has also sought to downplay these accusations and portray them as Western propaganda. But while Beijing has changed its mind, it doesn't mean that it can get away with not fixing structural problems in the Chinese economy. With that being said, the question that needs to be answered is, will the anti-Western stance and an emphasis on Chinese nationalism really help the Communist Party regain its lost trust? The rapid unwinding of China's zero-COVID regime has raised an interesting question for economists and investors. What happens if the country's economic growth remains sluggish even after all pandemic control measures are withdrawn? After all, 3 years of harsh restrictions have inflicted heavy damage on the world's second biggest economy. Local governments, including those of the richest Chinese cities, are running out of money. Chinese consumers are unlikely to raise spending with income reduced, and confidence in the private sector and among foreign investors is lacking. China's top leadership seems to be planning to take this problem. China has started to send out strong pro-growth messages in the last couple of days after ditching its dynamic zero COVID-19 policy. There is a near consensus within the Chinese government that a page has been turned, and the days of massive lockdowns are over, despite ongoing infections. After Beijing made it clear that the priority for the upcoming fiscal year will be economic growth, local government officials have already started to act like they did before. An investment promotion delegation from the island province of Hainan, led by one of its vice governors, recently visited Hong Kong. Beijing has even shown willingness to compromise on issues that it had stood firm on for years. There is, in general, a clear sense of urgency among Chinese leaders that they must do something to help the economy. It marks a contrast from a few years ago, when China was quite certain that its growth was unstoppable with the mantra of "the East is on the rise and the West is in decline." Beijing's policy swings from one extreme to another, ranging in areas from pandemic control to video gaming, have already frightened some investors, and some of the damage may be permanent. If certain foreign investors have already made the decision to cut exposure to China, it would be hard to regain their trust. But who knows? The situation might get even worse in the future. With growing apprehensions, the Chinese Communist Party must be decisive in its control. So what do you guys think about the looming tensions in China amid nationwide protests? Will the Chinese leadership regain the lost trust? Let us know in the comments section below. Make sure you press the like and subscribe button, and we'll see you guys in the next video.